Why we do what we do, a 7-level taxonomy of behavior causation. So this is an attempt to kind of integrate several approaches, philosophical, psychological approaches to what actually we live for, what we could call our essence, our human essence, and what determines our behavior. So there are many different theories and perspectives on what is actually our essence or what is really important for determining our behavior. We know that Sigmund Freud talked about the pleasure principle, for example, in driving our behavior. Alfred Adler turned towards the impact of the need for power that all humans have in order to strive for power. This is why we act. Viktor Frankl had the approach of highlighting meaning in our life, which drives our behavior. Schopenhauer and many others, Kant and so on, highlighted the will. The will is very important in what determines our behavior, and there are even many and many more. This is just as a kind of an introduction. So what basically is inherent in philosophical or psychological perspectives, or let's say philosophy of psychology, is that perspectives are inherently reductionistic because they narrow down reality to a certain view or even a model. So you may be aware of the story of Mullah Nasruddin searching for his lost key under a light in the dark. A passerby comes by and asks, what are you looking for? I'm looking for my keys. And where have you lost it? I lost it over there. Why are you looking here? I'm looking here because here is light. Yeah, and this is the typical approach we have in psychology, because each research tradition, each perspective had their particular methods of investigating phenomena. For example, behaviorism, we all know, they try to measure exactly stimuli and responses while ignoring the actual psyche, which they called the black box, because they did not adopt or acknowledge methods except for exactly measuring things. So no hypothetical constructs, for example. So these perspectives reduce information about the world to a few concepts, and they have their selective methods which are developed exactly to analyze their concepts. In generally, when we look into psychological empirical research, we have a relatively weak effect when we investigate the impact of isolated variables or 2 or 3 variables on a behavioral output. So it's relatively weak, and there's one point that we could make, that the research is done within a certain perspective which kind of ignores other variables, so the complex interactions of the variables that finally predict or explain a certain behavior. It was Thomas Kuhn, a philosopher of science, who said in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution, that all established natural sciences went through a pre-scientific period of arranging their subjects by names or schools of scientists rather than systematically. So basically, this is a sharp critique to psychology already 60 years ago, and we still can make the same claim. Psychology, we can ask whether it's kind of a discipline in a pre-paradigmatic stage. And in order to advance this critical situation and bring it to a next step, it was Julius Kuhl who invented or a theory, personality systems interactions theory, which is based on behavioral and neuroscientific research and logical thought about how to integrate different theories and models or even perspectives. And there is one essence of this theory, which is about a taxonomy of 7 levels on which the psyche operates. And the idea is that the different perspectives have hypotheses about certain hypothetical constructs and how they work, and that we can assign them to these single levels. Which does not mean that they operate in isolation. These levels cooperate within each other, inhibiting or showing excitations. But first of all, you need to classify the different processes into certain levels or layers or categories. So let's start with the first level, basic cognition and habits. This is much what behaviorism was talking about. The processes that are assigned to these levels are basic perception, the motor response, which we call basic cognition, and which basically form habits when we associate stimuli, the perception of stimuli, with motor responses. Habits are created via conditioning. So it's a very automatistic view of people, of humans, and this is why they investigated behavior in rats, and they tried to conclude onto humans that the same processes are going on. It's all about conditioning and stimulus response situations. And you saw this little girl. We might postulate that after you created such a habit, you do not need much motivation or will again, anymore in order to exert certain behaviors that you have trained. So every morning brushing the teeth, it may be aversive to little girls or boys, but after a while, when you get into the habit, when you created this habit, it just goes smoothly. So a second level, which we might call the temperamental level, comes from more biologically oriented psychology. So temperament is meant here in a very broad sense. So it's not just a trait, it's when we say, oh, you are full of temperament at the moment. So it's also a state. So in a very broad sense. So the temperament is much about the energy that we have, a general drive that drives our behavior. So not so much about specific emotions or positive, negative affect. It's very general. So driving every behavior, escaping, fight versus flight. So both of them actually. And because it comes from more biologically oriented psychology, the measures that they use are physiological measures like heart rate and later on also EEG and fMRI to investigate brain activation. So the temperamental processes can much be referred to the ascending reticular activation system, which was detected in the 1940s, which derive from the brainstem, and they spread the neurotransmitters associated with it spread throughout the entire brain and activate different areas, activate the will, activate positive, negative emotions. So level 3 is exactly about this emotions, or let's call it affect in a very broad sense, or incentive motivation, which means positive incentives, but also negative incentives, which we also can call punishment. So there are many different aspects of lust, what we can strive for, because it just feels pleasurable or hedonistic. And the perspective which is most closely related to this in psychology is the psychodynamic or psychoanalytic perspective. So, which can be seen in the Freud's concept of lust, unlust. So he concentrated in his theorizing much on the lust aspect, so the hedonic drive, the libido. He had the term of pleasure principle. But there is also unlust when he said that we strive for relaxation to get rid of negative things, of angst, and so on. So this level is much about short-term satisfaction. So we are satisfied in the short run, but not in the long run when we just go impulsively for what we immediately want to have to satisfy our immediate needs. In the brain, this is much associated with the reinforcement system, so wanting, craving. The nucleus accumbens is related to it and elicits dopamine, for example, or also, so the unlust to the threat system, when we know that the amygdala is strongly involved, but also other systems. I skipped the fourth level and come to it later to make a stronger point for this one. So let's go over to the level 5, motives. Motives have basically the psychodynamic perspective in the background as well, which kind of entered the psychology of motives in the 1970s, 1980s, where academic psychology tried to investigate motives by measuring responses to pictures. You all know the Rorschach test or the thematic apperception test, but they try to bring it to a next level of measurement. So in the psychodynamic sense, these motives can already be seen in the psychosexual stages of oral, anal, Oedipal stages, which are somehow related to what later the psychology of motives called the affiliation motive. So oral need is much about love and affiliating with others. There's power as well, which is strongly related to the Oedipal conflict of the dominance that you have with the same sex parent, or the autonomy motive, which is strongly related to the anal phase, for example, where the child tries to do things on his or her own, like going to the toilet and stuff like that. Motives are considered today as cognitive emotional networks that are formed to satisfy one's needs, one's more elementary needs. So it's a cognitive aspect that comes in addition. It's about autobiographical memory of previous experiences that I had, how to satisfy my needs. So it's not just a very basic need which we might already find in rats or even below rats in evolutionary sense. So it's a higher level. So we could call it the intelligent form of needs. So Alfred Adler's idea of striving for power is strongly related to this level of motives. Or maybe let's take philosopher Marilyn Monroe, a career is wonderful, which relates to the power motive, but you can't curl up with it on a cold night, which refers to the affiliation motive. Now, also Erich Fromm, The Art of Loving, contrasted in, let's say, the terms of power and affiliation, these two motives. To have or to be as well refers to the idea that these different motives are kind of refer to different modes of processing. So the power motive is more about to have status, to have money, and to be is more strongly related to autonomy or to love. The sixth level is about complex cognition. I mentioned elementary cognition in the beginning, which is about perception and motor response, which we all see in even very elementary forms of living, of beings. But complex cognition which is specific or at least typical for humans. So in some sense, problem solving, we know this is what humanoids also have, but our prefrontal cortex is much more, much richer in humans. So the complex cognition is probably 80% of what psychology or even philosophy is talking about. So in psychology, the perspective that highlighted cognition as compared to emotion and the other levels is cognitivism. Yeah? Well, it's already included in the psychodynamic idea of, well, there are ego functions and so on, or fair, but cognitivism is the one which kind of tried to bring it into the direction. Everything is about cognition. Our behavior is driven by reflection, decision making, and so on. There are at least two mental modes that are relevant in, for example, personality psychology, but also in general psychology, that we have two ways of thinking. So one is analytical thought or logic, so sequential thinking about problems, which is related to propositional knowledge. Typically, it's logic, it's conscious, it's sequential processing of semantic information. We might refer it to the concept of nous in Aristotle's thinking, pure reason maybe to some degree. So these are just heuristic assignments, because these philosophers had much more broader ideas about it. Pure reason in Kant's ideas, secondary processing in Freud's ideas, system 2 in Kahnemann's recent theorizing. And there's holistic sensing. I do not call it reflection, because reflection has the association of being analytical and conscious. So it's more kind of a feeling, a gut feeling, a sensing, but in an intelligent way, that this modus of operandi integrates lots of semantic experiential information to come to, let's say, a decision or an intuition about what is right or wrong. So it's parallel processing, because all this information needs to be integrated at the same time, not like analytical thinking. Now when you think about that, you might forget about the other thing. You need kind of a parallel processing approach. And the concept of Gestalt is actually reflecting this experiential parallel processing, because there are many information in a Gestalt which makes it the information a whole. So this more refers to the concept of primary processing, dreams and so on in Freudian thinking, or the system 1, fast, heuristic, not very exact, but and preconscious in Kahnemann's thinking. We could position Viktor Frankl here, although this is much more strongly, much more is related to other ideas as well. The next level, for example, about self and self-management. But why we can also assign Viktor Frankl to the complex cognition is because the type of search for meaning is not very strongly in his ideas related to analytical thought. So that we try to find meaning in our life, not in an, by logically thinking why it makes meaning, but because of spontaneous ideas that just come by itself. Yeah. So he highlights meaning over pleasure or power as the essence of human being, and meaning through holistic sensing. So he had the intervention in his logotherapy called de-reflection, that you try to make the patient less thinking in their analytical minds. Yeah? So more feeling And he used different techniques to do it. Or we can also see this in his idea that happiness, we should not make it a goal that we perceive, yeah? But it comes as a byproduct when we do not think about this goal. So it's also kind of a de-reflection, yeah? Or like the saying, the way is the goal, yeah? So this is much related to Viktor Frankl's idea of search for meaning, and it can be found in every situation spontaneously, like the bird that we observe in a certain situation of adversity, like in the concentration camp, which he experienced for years. And seeing meaning in these small things. And this is a spontaneous thing that comes by parallel processing, not by thinking about things. Afterwards, after you had these moments of meaning, you can logically think about and even strengthen your idea, but without this holistic processing, it's really hard. This is what we know from depressed individuals. They try to logically think about things, but when it's disconnected from this holistical thought, it's really hard to find meaning. Yeah, so we could also call it pleasure in a broader sense, so in an eudaimonic well-being, yeah, because it basically interconnects with this third layer. So there is dopamine elicited when we have a moment of insight of meaning. Yeah, so it's not that these different levels are separated, but they are interconnected. They show interactions. But it's more than pure lust, that satisfy our needs for the moment. On the last level, the seventh level, there is self-management, or we might call it self-regulation, self-guidance, and this is basically the level where existentialists and many philosophical approaches are thinking about, and psychology as well. We may link it to complex cognition, so the previous level, but it's much more. It's not that we can logically think, it's also much about myself. What is important for me? What is relevant for me? So this level actually links complex cognition to the pursuit of personal goals in our life. So the perspectives where this level derives from is much about humanistic psychology or voluntarism. In psychology, there is Maslow, Frankl, Deci, and Ryan still today, which might be associated with this. Self-management could be defined as the coordination of all these levels and the processes and resources that we find on these levels to reach a certain goal that we have set or that we have in our mind subconsciously. There are two forms which we might postulate, which one is more the one that disciplines ourselves, which is more conscious, suppressing seemingly conflicting inner voices, which reminds us of dictatorship. So we are very bad to ourselves. You need to do this and that, you must do that. So it's about self-discipline or self-control. Our intention memory, so having intentions, has the tendency to become kind of obsessive about things and to control. So it's much related to conscious, effortful process, analytic processing. These are things that we could cluster around this concept of self-control. Also introjection, so when the superego or the society, important, significant others, society tells you you have to do that and or that, so social expectations strongly relate to this one. As compared to self-control, there's self-regulation, which as a term sounds more smooth already than control. This integrates all inner voices that we have, like in a democracy. Also our emotions that may go counter to a current goal, but they get into a discussion, say, oh, well, I do not feel about learning now. Let's relax a little bit. Yeah? Self-discipline would say, oh, you're not allowed to do that. Yeah? So it's a different mindset which works in parallel, seals all the different inner voices. It's called basically self-regulation because the integrative self that integrates all these different aspects like emotions, goals, reflections, autobiographical memory, is the basis of this self-regulation. So when this system in the brain is activated, we are more able to guide ourselves to goals without punishing towards reaching a goal. It's strongly related to holistic processing on the previous level of complex cognition. So this is also when we identify with a certain goal or value, which means that the goals that come from outside, from society, become connected even on a neural level to the already existing core self. So when this system connects to these goals, then we can say, oh, I can identify with it. Yeah, it's not just a superego, and I integrate it, and then things become more pleasurable. Yeah? So the goals that we pursue and are more strongly related to the nucleus accumbens and acylation of dopamine. So this level relates more to long-term satisfaction, the goals that we pursue, rather than the immediate pursuit of pleasures on level 3. So it's also related to the delay of gratification rather than impulsivity, and in theological terms we might say the last will be the first. The more we see the entire picture, not just ourselves, also other people, parallel processing of needs and having long-term goals, self-transcendence, might be related to some degree to this saying. So we could also say it's pleasure in a broader sense. It elicits dopamine, but it's even much more. It's about psychological richness, also meaning, personal meaning that we can find. This is just to give it as an overview, and one which we skipped is level 4, which might be called coping with stress. So why is this considered a distinct system? So well, in the brain there are two distinct systems related to stress regulation. So this is the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal system and the sympathetic nervous system. So we do have brain system related to stress regulation. So this idea of coping with stress also originates from Freud's broad thinking when he talked about repression, defense mechanisms. So that's where it started, and it developed an own tradition of research within psychology, which was also very physiological. And these stress systems become active when personal resources to master a situation are challenged. And we need to invest more, which means these stress systems become active, which is good when stress is not too much and not too long. Yeah? So it's eustress, but it becomes de-stress when the resources are truly challenged over a longer time, or chronic stress. So it has a particular specific, this system, the coping with stress or coping system, position among these other systems. It's an intermediate mediating system, because when it is over-challenged, we see regression, which means that our behavior is dominated by elementary levels. And when we are relaxed, in the absence of stress, or when we are able to cope with stress and we have resources, we are better able to activate the higher systems such as complex cognition, yeah, analytical thought, holistic thought, yeah, and even the self, yeah, on the level of self-management. So this is why this is an important system. Yeah, we could also use the term progression as the counterpart of regression. This is when, yeah, we are kind of stimulated. Yeah, so it's not stress, but in the beginning, yeah, so that we are kind of a little bit challenged. So the prefrontal cortex, it's much more aware, but when it becomes too much in an inverse U-shaped form, then we show this regression, and it's hard for us to have an overview of the situation, to act, yeah, with a free will, we could say, because we are not free anymore, because we are dominated by the lower, by the elementary systems. So we would add coping with stress here. Yeah, we have regression towards the lower system, progression, yeah, moving up to include the higher systems in predicting behavior. And in one paper, Kuhl and myself, we related this to degrees of freedom of will. So the more levels are included in the process of decision making, so when we have a broad overview of everything, we could call it to have the maximum of free will. And the more we regress, we are not that free anymore. We are more acting like animals, yeah? And this is the momentary case of regression. So this is how we could, from today's neuroscientific perspective, interpret Freud's idea of regression, which he used for saying that yeah, we are regressing to previous stage in ontogenetic development. So I will not go into this. This is just to show that all these levels are related, strongly related to certain areas in the brain, and this is just a very coarse idea. There are much more areas related to these different levels. Let's quickly go through what actually is meant here by causation when I said different levels that cause behavior. So here it's about proximate causation, so efficient causation in Aristotle's terms. It's not about the purpose, the teleology, and it's external context. The idea is that external context and stimuli activate certain areas in the brain, yeah, certain psychological levels that themselves produce behavior. Yeah? So this is not excluding the context and the situations. It's just saying that these situations are processed by our mind, and which finally cause behavior. So it's also a multi-causation of behavior, so it's very seldom that it's only one level causing behavior, but they interact among each other. But with regression, it's less multi-causal. We have functional interaction among processes, even on the same level, so it's much more complex than I show here. This is more first taxonomy, and there are ideas about how they are related. This is what general psychology is about. And PSI theory has certain assumption about how these processes interact, but it's far from being, let's say, an exhaustive theory yet. Yeah, so it's also about the functional cause, yeah, how exactly these processes are related, independent on which what is the Stoffursache, the stuff on which it is built, like cells or yeah, computer cells. It's a deterministic model that includes the idea of free will, so it's basically based on the approach of emergent compatibilism. Yes. So now we could ask the question, how is personality growth going on? when we consider these different levels. And there are a couple of examples. So we could talk about growth when we are able to get rid of dysfunctional habits, patterns, and create new habits on the first level. Temperamental level, when we are able to motivate ourselves doing sports, and by being more activated, our brain becomes more activated. And when we make it a habit, so including the first level, we can maybe better able to function in our lives. So we have aspects on each level that could be related to personality or personal growth, affect and incentive motivation, when we reduce emotional dependency, exert stimulus control that we do not or avoid negative stimuli or people that are negative for us. Coping with stress, eliminating causes for regression and defensiveness. Motives, we might reduce or strengthen our power motive depending on how strongly it is active, or increasing the achievement motive. Complex cognition, for example, strengthening analytical or holistical processing, reducing dysfunctional self-incongruent attitudes or life goals. Self-management, strengthening self-regulation, so the integrative self in the process of guiding our behavior, which includes self-awareness, self-insight, self-congruence, value integration, but also adversity integration, which we talked much about in the context of personality growth and the processing of traumata. Some of these levels or processes are more closely connected to what we would call personality growth in essence, so to a thorough growth, to a transformation. And some others are more closely related to minor changes, so assimilating to the environment. So to conclude, there are different perspectives, philosophical perspectives on psychological processes that assign key roles of psychological phenomena to cause behavior. And each perspective defines their processes as kind of being the essence of human being, or personality. Behavior saying, well, it's all about stimulation, the context that we live in that makes up our behavior, and that's it. So these psychological perspectives are reductionistic inherently in itself, but we may have some advancement in psychology when we try to connect these different perspectives by assigning them or their processes to certain levels and investigate the complex interactions of them, how they influence or even determine behavior. There are also complex interactions among these levels and within these levels, so it's not a simple idea of isolated processes, so it's multi-causal. Personality growth can principally involve each level, and I think that's future research is needed in psychology to empirically investigate how these levels interact and on which level growth can occur and how it influences our behavior. Thank you so much for your attention.